What's up, everybody? Dr. Rossi, and today we're going to be talking about something really important in psychiatry. It's one that actually confuses me on a regular basis and probably confuses a lot of you too. Whether you're somebody who's in treatment or you're a provider who's providing treatment, then you're going to benefit from this video for sure. So the topic of today's video is anxiety and anxiety disorders. And I've said before that I personally have felt anxiety in my life. And if you want to feel real anxiety, then all you need to do is sign up for medical school, because you will certainly feel anxiety on a daily basis as you're going through the process of becoming a doctor. So that is where a lot of the anxiety was the worst for me personally. I mean, at one point I was even waking up with nocturnal panic attacks, like waking up in the middle of the night, heart racing out of my chest, short of breath, feeling like I was dying, right? Typical of somebody who's having a panic attack. So we're going to talk about anxiety disorders because every time I research this and read about it, and I see like, what's the latest on anxiety disorders, I come away unsatisfied. I'm not satisfied by what I'm reading. And I come away with this feeling that we really don't know. We can't decide. Are anxiety disorders really their own separate diagnostic category on their own? Are they the direct result of another more serious mental illness, for example, bipolar disorder or major depression? Or are they just a product of our modern life, the way that we live? Now, every time somebody says to me, Dr. Rossi, I don't believe you, and I don't believe any of this psychiatry stuff. Okay, fair enough. Reasonable to think about, because let's face it, we don't have this stuff that other medical specialties have, like great imaging results that can show us, a stroke in this area of the brain or whatever the case is. But let's discuss one of the things I like to do when people say that. I usually will say to them that when you're questioning psychiatric illness, there are diseases and disease processes that we have actually seen consistently throughout history. They've been around for centuries, right? So when we take, for example, melancholia and mania, those were described in ancient Greek texts, and they're described throughout history, right? So those disorders that really are pervasive, accurately described, consistent across centuries, for example, those are probably real psychiatric diagnoses, right? So just a little bit of a way of thinking about it. But what we don't see is we don't see a whole lot of anxiety disorders being described across history. It appears to be more of a modern phenomenon. So we're going to set the framework today for discussing anxiety disorders, and eventually we're going to go through all of them. But for now, I really want to kind of set the tone for what these disorders are and why we should be learning about them and thinking about them differently. Anxiety is a good example of a natural human emotion. As I said before, I've had anxiety. We've all had anxiety. We can all think of situations that were anxiety provoking. And ultimately, a little bit of anxiety, or even a fair amount of anxiety rather, is a good thing, right? Because we all need a certain amount of arousal, we all need a certain amount of motivation to get us through difficult things, such as medical school, right? Like, obviously, when I was talking about the idea of having these like panic attacks at night, that was not necessarily productive at that point. My performance is going down as a medical student, right? Because the stress and the anxiety is too high. And what we can look at here is what they call an inverted U kind of shape, right, to the graph. And what it basically is telling us is that to a certain point, anxiety is beneficial. It really helps me to perform better and to perform at my highest level, which is what people who are trying to be high achievers are going to want. So if you're trying to be a doctor, you're trying to be a lawyer, you're trying to do something great in your field of study, then you're going to need a certain amount of anxiety to get to that point. However, what we wind up seeing is that at some point, once that level becomes too high, functional impairment hits, and then a person will likely be diagnosed with one of these disorders. So I've talked to you guys in previous videos that anxiety is underappreciated. I believe when I was discussing the medication quetiapine or Seroquel, this is a medication that works really well in terms of the effect size is very large. It's shown to be very effective for the treatment of generalized anxiety disorder, for example. However, it did not gain FDA approval for that disorder. And the reason behind it is maybe, right, We just don't view anxiety disorders or anxiety as a serious enough illness. We certainly believe it's a serious enough illness to have depression because we do allow medications like quetiapine, for example, to be prescribed as an adjunctive treatment. So again, anxiety disorders have largely been viewed as a less severe form of psychiatric illness. Now, I've also heard another very interesting take on this, and Dr. Nasir Gami has detailed this very well, and I really feel like this speaks to me because it's something I observed when I was going through my training and never quite understood until I learned more about the topic. So he thinks of this as anxiety is the fever of psychiatry. Right? So let's say that again. Anxiety is the fever of psychiatry. It's a non-specific symptom that is better explained by another underlying disease process in most cases. And that's part of what we're here to talk about. So ultimately, the way you could think about this is that when somebody develops a fever, there's many underlying reasons why they develop a fever. So we can kind of apply this to anxiety the same way. When somebody develops anxiety, there's many potential reasons why they're anxious. Could it be driven by depression? Could it be driven by bipolar illness? Could it be driven by some other disorder, essentially, that we're not quite picking up on, or that if we are picking up on it, it's not adequately treated, thus the anxiety remains. Now, again, I think part of our problem is we don't really understand how anxiety fits into psychiatric illness, right? We don't understand how it fits into the diagnostic hierarchy. Now, that's because of a number of reasons, right? One reason might be that anxiety doesn't often carry the lethality of other disorders like melancholic depression, for example, where suicide risk is very high. Although somebody who has very, very severe anxiety might attempt to take their own life as well. Now, when anxiety, of course, is at its worst, people are impaired, and they have impaired cognitive function, they have impaired judgment, and this results in more impulsive behavior, which of course can mimic other disorders such as bipolar illness, right? So we want to be careful not to mistake increased arousal and psychomotor activation of anxiety for those of, say, bipolar mania, for example. So anxiety disorders are very common. In fact, anxiety disorders affect 18% of the US population. So you can imagine large number of people you encounter on a daily basis are suffering from anxiety. And that's how I get through my day, is I think about this and I say, well, most people are anxious just like me, so it's no big deal. I'm just going to go through my day and do what I do, right? So one way of thinking about it. Some consider anxiety, though, like I said, to be like a non-specific symptom. It's considered to be the quote-unquote fever of psychiatry. And I think we can all agree that anxiety is pervasive throughout mental disorders, right? Mental psychiatric illness. We can see anxiety in schizophrenia, we can see anxiety in bipolar disorder, we can see anxiety in depression, right? And other anxiety-related disorders, of course, like PTSD or obsessive compulsive disorder. So, we also know that anxiety could possibly be normal, right? Because we actually all have a degree of neuroticism, one of the big 5 personality traits, right? So we know that anxiety is part of everyone's personality to some degree, and of course, some people are higher in the trait of neuroticism than others. And we've all encountered these individuals, whether it be clinically or in our own personal lives, where that person is just generally an anxious person. They're anxious about everything. They're anxious about driving to the store. They're anxious about picking their kids up. They're anxious about making the right decision on a financial investment, right? They're anxious about everything that they do. So neuroticism is a part of our personality structure, and everybody has it. Some are going to be higher in neuroticism than others. So what I pose to you guys here is the question: if anxiety is occurring in the context of a personality trait, another psychiatric illness such as bipolar disorder or depression, is it really a separate diagnosis? Should it be a separate diagnosis? Because this is a lot of what we're trying to kind of determine here. If we really think about it, anxiety disorders, like I said, are not something that's described in the literature throughout time. It's more of a modern phenomenon, something that's happened more recently in psychiatry. And we also think about the anxiety disorders as sharing very similar neurocircuitry, right? The neurocircuitry involved in depression and anxiety are similar, maybe even the same, right? In the sense that we know that these are the same pathways that are driving these symptoms, and also that we use the same treatments and medications. It's not uncommon for someone with major depression to also have a component of anxiety, and to, of course, be treated with an SRI or a serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, for example, as well as benzodiazepines, honestly. In fact, alprazolam is approved for the treatment of major depression, right? So there is that as well. Many of the same neurocircuitry is involved. Much of the same treatment is the same, especially when we're talking about things like generalized anxiety disorder. And unfortunately, our DSM offers us no information here. It doesn't tell us what to do. It doesn't tell us how to diagnose. Should we add generalized anxiety disorder on as an additional diagnosis? Should we consider it to be part of the major depressive episode the person we're seeing is in currently? So this is where we really need a diagnostic hierarchy to kind of tell us how to go about systematically treating these disorders, and then seeing whether or not the anxiety goes away when the bipolar disorder is better controlled, when the major depression is better controlled. So that is the question that I'm posing to you guys today. Is it a separate diagnosis, or is it simply part or a construct of personality and other psychiatric disorders? So for today, I'm going to hold the video there, guys. I think this is a good introduction to some of the thinking I've been doing on anxiety disorders in general. So I wanted to bring it to your attention how we're kind of viewing anxiety as, again, the fever of psychiatry. It's something that is non-specific. It's pervasive throughout multiple mental illnesses, including bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and major depression, of course. And it's also something that is treated in largely the same way that we treat other depressive disorders, for example, with so-called serotonin reuptake inhibitors as a primary treatment, as well as adjunctive benzodiazepines, all of which we're going to talk about in subsequent videos. But before we get into those, I want to do videos on some of the more common anxiety disorders. And of course, I'm going to cover the big ones like generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder. And I'm also going to lump in here ones that are no longer categorized necessarily as anxiety disorders, that being obsessive compulsive disorder and PTSD, because I think it's relevant to talk about them in this context. So until the next video, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you are not a subscriber to the channel, please consider doing so. It really does help me to keep this thing going. And if you guys have questions, comments, you wanna reply and tell me whether or not you think anxiety is a separate disorder, then go ahead and do that in the comments section, and I will see you in the next video.